In the late 1960s, a wave of German bands and musicians emerged intent on creating new sounds and exploring new technologies.
As an artist, you have to create something new, your own way. You have to create your own art.
We were pretty much aware that we weren't raised in the Mississippi Delta, or we weren't raised in Liverpool. Our generation had to come up with a counterpoint to that. If you want to come up with a new sound, you want to touch new ground, you have to use new material, or at least change your perspective. Using machines open up another door for this new quality.
So many musicians, so many bands, so many influences, this just can happen once, I think, yeah. It was the Blütezeit, the blooming, yeah, of German music at its peak.
This film not only explores the various artists of this experimental movement, but also focuses on the group whose music would influence so much of modern electronica, Kraftwerk.
Obviously, the aesthetic investment was into something completely different from what all the other bands were into. All the other bands were into with the most different means, but they were all into experience. And Kraftwerk was not that. It was obviously about distance to music. There was something conceptual, there was something humorous, there was irony.
The difference between Kraftwerk and the other bands wished to totally disassociate themselves from the past of the Germans' history. Kraftwerk were different. They were willing to embrace the past. In so doing, they actually, in the long term, they invented a new kind of aesthetic that people around the world could really relate to by using humour and experiment and brilliant understanding of electronic sound. They basically remade German identity and made it something to actually look at.
The Second World War left Germany in ruins. Over 9 million German soldiers and civilians dead, numerous cities destroyed, and the country split into zones occupied by both the Allied and Soviet military. By 1949, the country was divided into a Soviet East and a capitalist West Germany. And where the East was a socialist state, the West adopted a social market economy that by the 1950s would see the country enjoy a steady period of growth. Despite this economic stability, the youth of the country were born into a ruptured world in which their elders were viewed with suspicion and in which a guilt over the very fact of being a German was widespread. And so by the late 1950s, this new generation began to embrace the youth culture of their Allied occupiers.
Den alten Strukturen im Lande, das heißt mit einer Generation, die zu der Zeit, also in den 60ern, noch überall die entscheidenden Positionen innehatte, nicht nur an den Spitzen der Gesellschaft, also als Unternehmer, Politiker, sondern auch im ganzen Mittelbau als Lehrer, Professoren, Richter, Staatsanwälte. Überall saß noch die Generation, die den Nationalsozialismus mitgemacht hatte und zu einem nicht unerheblichen Prozentsatz auch mitgewollt hatte. Für junge Arbeiter war aber die neue Zeit, die da kam, mit all ihren Verheißungen in Form von persönlicher Freiheit, Konsum. Es war eine sehr wirtschaftlich prosperierende Zeit, ein großes Versprechen. Also das Vorbild dabei war Amerika. Und wer immer dann als junger Mensch in den 60ern mit diesen alten Strukturen, diesem Autoritarismus, der einen von ersten Tag an zur Unterwürfigkeit erzog, zum Untertanen und, wenn nötig, zum guten Soldaten oder zum guten Arbeiter, je nachdem wie die Zeiten waren. Wer da dagegen war, für den war diese Musik, die aus den USA kam und aus England, einfach die Verheißung, dass es ein anderes Leben geben könne.
And Germany would play a pivotal part in the early history of Western popular music. A number of clubs began to appear in the major cities, and with UK bands more adept at imitating American acts than the Germans, soon these clubs were full of British rock and roll groups. At the centre of this was Hamburg, a major port with a large entertainment district. Here young rock bands played to an audience of both German teenagers and Allied Navy crews, and it was here that the Beatles learnt their craft. Yet the German groups who began to emerge were often simply imitating those British beat bands, and this scene would have little in common with the movement that would eventually emerge.
In terms of music, pop music, there was not much. There was, of course, the Hamburg world, which was shaped by, which was a vibrant music scene, and one that also would cross over to other arts, but that was based mainly on traveling British and American bands like the Beatles and others famously, but also like regulars were like bands like Ian and the Zodiacs or something like that, who were but then doing things like accompanying poetry readings by very advanced poets. So, but that's right, there were basically no Germans doing anything interesting musically, with the exception of free jazz. Free jazz in Germany, I would go to the legacy of people like Peter Brötzmann, who was involved with the Fluxus movement in the early 60s, and others. There was a free jazz movement in Berlin happening around people like Alexander von Schlippenbach, Sven Åke Johansson, who came from Sweden, and this was, of course, a completely unique musical movement, and it was based by it was based on scenes in German cities. And out of the Berlin free jazz movement, for example, you had certain bands coming out who were close to the later electronic scene. Like Sven Åke Johansson had this band, Moderne Europäische Dorfmusik, Modern European Village Music, which was kind of a electronic avant-garde rock free jazz mixture. They recorded in the late 60s, I think 2 albums. And they played at the same places where early Tangerine Dream played.
And it was out of this new rock and jazz culture that German variations of the Anglo-American musical model began to take shape. By 1967, the German counterculture was emerging, with students demonstrating and communes being formed. With political tensions heightened by the death of student Benno Ohnesorg, Berlin in particular was a center for unrest. And at the same time as this youth movement was growing, new music from America was influencing the bands of this scene.
In '67, it was for the Berlin scene, there was an ignition when the Mothers of Invention came to play. That was an interesting concert because, all the students, the SDS went there, the pupils, all the political scene went there. Well, it was about 10,000 people, and I think most of the scene was there. And people had waited for a band like this to come to Berlin. So it was like a swing from the nice Jerry and the Pacemakers and Equals and pop groups from Britain, Great Britain, to flower power hippie thing. And I think these are also the influences which helped the German musicians develop their own style.
But while much of the German musical scene was simply intent on now mimicking a new kind of American music, experimental musicians began to emerge who would shape a unique sound. Konrad Schnitzler, who had studied sculpture under radical German artist Joseph Beuys in Düsseldorf, was central to this new movement. Having relocated to Berlin in the mid-60s, he was a trained artist and not a musician, but he began working with colleagues Hans Hakim Rodelius and Boris Schack on a new form of experimental music that would eventually embrace electronics.
My dream was always to make sounds and music, but I couldn't because I was not a musician and never learned. And there were, also before, there were all these young people making this kind of hippie music with a drum and flute and all this, and I was hating this. Anyway, I was never liking melodies because a melody is like a worm in your head. You hear this melody and the whole day it rattles in your head. I didn't want it. I want to have something what goes in and you lost it already. And Boris and Achim said, "Oh no, not this. I other idea about making music. Only if you can play an instrument, you can make free sounds. And I want to have, let's say, noise sounds composed together in a way what is interesting. You know? Like if the steam hammer goes here and the bird pipes there and a car comes and the airplane goes over. If you are the director of it, then you say, hey, stop, moment, don't come now, you know, now all together or whatever, you know. This is the only philosophy I want, and the philosophy behind is, as an artist, you have to create something new.